At 5, 76 years ago this week, Navy pilots turned the tide in what is often described as the pivotal battle in the Pacific theater in World War II. Solemn ceremony took place today in Virginia Beach, remembering the heroes of the Battle of the Midway. 13 News Now reporter Mike Gooding was there.
Well, and David, the members of the Association of Naval Aviation came together with the Navy to honor the fallen and salute the bravery of all who took part. After months of defeats, finally, for the United States, victory. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and a cruiser were sunk, and more than 10 times as many enemy casualties were inflicted.
They had no right to win, yet they did. And in doing so, they changed the course of the war.
Today, 76 years later, they remembered the battle that turned the tide in the Pacific, Midway. It was June 3rd through June 7th, 1942, just 6 months after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. Today's commemoration at the Association of Naval Aviation Monument at the Virginia Beach oceanfront. The guest of honor was retired Captain Dexter Rumsey, a veteran of the Battle of Midway, now 101 years old. Against overwhelming odds, the U.S. Navy's pilots like Rumsey prevailed, forever changing the definition of combat. Going forward, it would be the aircraft carrier-based strike operations, not battleships, that would lead the way. Pilots of later generations say that the Midway heroes were an inspiration to them.
Because it's the heart of naval aviation in World War II.
If it had gone the other way, we might not be speaking English today.
Well, the thing is you can't be a naval aviator without the story of Midway. What an impressive group of guys. It's an inspiration to you.
And of course, there was a steep price to pay for the U.S. too. 307 Americans lost their lives in the battle, plus the carriers Yorktown and destroyer Hammond were sunk, and 145 U.S. planes were destroyed. Reporting live, Mike Gooding, 13 News Now.